Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to the very last poem in the collection called By the Roadside, to the states to identify, that's an interesting word here, the 16th, 17th, or 18th Presidentiad. Now this spelling of president with the E-I-A-D at the end of it, of course, is going to give a kind of foreign flavor to what will be one of the more notorious poems of Leaves of Grass. This is going to be Whitman at some of his iconoclastic, most violent. And the question will obviously be, why is this the last poem? That will sit right before the drum tap section. I think we'll see some connections between the two. There will be a reason for this poem being placed here right now. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and you've been following stuff from the very beginning, all the way up from the inscriptions. I gave a set of introductory comments to Roadside, and we just finished with offerings. By the way, one or two of you pointed out that we didn't talk about the origination of the offerings poem. I'll do it now in our Nortons before I get to states. The offerings poem, by the way, was in the 1860 edition. The poem was the 7th stanza of the Debris poem in 1867. It was a separate poem entitled Picture in 1871-76. It acquired its present title of Offerings as a Passage to India poem. We've commented so much about that. And it was transferred to Roadside, of course, by 81. So I'm sorry that I failed to put that in my previous lecture, but now hopefully you're watching these in order, and so you're able to come to them. Now this poem states is a fascinating one. Norton tells us, of the messenger leaves of the 1860 edition, this poem was reprinted without change in all following editions, which tells us right away this was a poem that was important to Whitman. Whitman himself indicates in a manuscript notes of his blue copy, as it's sometimes referred to, edition, he composed it in the 3 years of 1857 and 58 and 59. We normally think of it as an 1860 poem, and of course think about what happens in 1861, the horrific war. So this poem is an important poem in that kind of history. Obviously, the 16th, 17th, and 18th presidents refers to the administrations of Fillmore and Pierce and Buchanan. We'll get more to that in a second. Towards which the passion and scorn of the poet found expression not alone in these verses, but also in his political pamphlet, The 18th Presidency, unpublished during his lifetime, and yet very, very much an important part of how we read this poem today. Now again, when he mentions these three presidents, the 16th here, he's talking about Fillmore, 1850 to 1853. The 17th is Franklin Pierce of 1853 to 1857, and of course the 18th is James Buchanan, 1857 to 1861. Some arguing that those three chaps might have been the reason for some of the most horrific events in the history of America. There's counter-arguments to that, obviously. I think it was a difficult time. I don't think we can ever just hang it around the neck of a single leader. However, Whitman certainly had serious issues that he found with each one of these. Now, pay attention to the 6 question marks and the 5 exclamation points that will play with this. And notice as well his use of these question words, why and who and what. It reads like this. Why reclining, interrogating, why myself and all drowsing? What deepening twilight, scum floating atop of the waters? Who are they as bats and night dogs askant in the capital? What a filthy Presidentiad! O south, your torrid suns, O north, your arctic freezings. Are those really congressmen? Are those the great judges? Is that the president? Then I will sleep a while yet, for I see that these states sleep for reasons, with gathering murk, with muttering thunder, and lambent shoots, we all duly awake. South, north, east, west, inland and seaboard, we will surely awake. Now, it's interesting that the poem begins with reclining and ends with awake. In other words, the poem begins with sleeping and it ends with waking up. And the idea of waking up, of course, is one that we're familiar with. Among the Transcendentalists, it was one of their favorite, as we've said in a number of lectures on LearnStrong.net, one of the favorite metaphors. You'll remember that it is Thoreau who says it in Walden. Before those famous lines, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately," he will say it, we must learn to awaken, to reawaken, and to keep ourselves awake. Not by mechanical aids, he says, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not, leave us in the greatest moments. He says it. The fact of a conscious endeavor. So that idea of being awakened is one. Spiritual awakening, obviously, is what we're speaking about here. Let's now go through the poem. Again, Whitman is vicious in this poem, and we've seen this already. To a President, 1860, he wrote that one. A Boston Ballad, 1854, we saw that one from 1855. And as we've mentioned, his little essay, lecture essay to the 18th Presidency in 1856. So clearly Whitman was already playing this game of what's wrong with these leaders. The word reclining will take us back to I Sing the Body Electric, passage 9. Why reclining? Interrogating. In other words, just asking questions but not really doing anything. Why? And then of course he uses the word myself, which will take us back to Song of Myself. Why myself and all? I told you he likes this word, all, drowsing. By the way, this is the only use in all of Leaves of Grass of the word drowsing. I find that fascinating, and obviously it takes us to Thoreau. What deepening, it's an interesting word, deepening twilight. And then notice all these exclamation points to come. Scum floating atop of the waters. Now, you'll maybe remember the word scum from As I Ebbed with the Ocean of Life, passage 1. We commented on it when we were looking at it. Scum floating atop of the waters. And this makes us think about that great word picture that Bacon has in the New Atlantis or Organon, I can't remember where. He says that, it's a funny thing about civilization. The important stuff sinks to the bottom of the river. The frivolous stuff floats across the top. And I think, here we're playing a similar kind of game. Notice, the idea of waters again, or a stream, will be one of those central metaphors that Whitman will constantly use to talk about history. Notice he asks now, who are they? And then he starts to use animal language. Who are they as bats and night dogs? And then he uses the word ascant, and it will only be used one more time profoundly in Lilacs, passage 15. We'll look for it when we come to it. That sideways or indirect look, right? Like, with skepticism, we might say, in the capital. And then of course, he's making his criticism of these three leaders that have been in the capital. Where, in other words, what do we want to say about them? Well, his next line will remove all doubt. What a filthy president. Wow, right? This word filthy only gets used one time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. I find that fascinating. And then in parentheses, which obviously we've seen a number of times in Leaves of Grass, O south, and then he'll talk about torrid suns. Torrid here is only used one time in all Leaves of Grass, and it's here. O north, your Arctic freezings, between the torrid and the freezings. I think, again, Whitman is already gesturing towards, in 1860, what he knows is coming, and he has that sense, that sixth sense that artists, poets have, that something really terrible is about to happen. Are those really congressmen? The modernity of a poem like this and a line like this is palpable, right? Because once again we find ourselves in an American history sometimes asking about leadership, and here notice are those really congressmen? Are those the great judges? Notice capitalized. Is that the president? By the way, if you flip back I think it, for most of you will be one page, to the little poem, Two Thoughts Away, if I can say it that way. Do you remember this one? When we go back to it, he says, of justice, as if justice could be anything but the same ample law expounded by natural judges and saviors. Only there he didn't capitalize judges, and here he will. So notice he'll capitalize judges. Are those the great judges? Obviously talking about the Supreme Court. And then he says, is that the president? And then the word then. So notice he'll begin by asking some rhetorical questions. Really? As in seriously? But then he'll get to the word then. Then he says, I will sleep a while yet. Notice we're back to drowsing. I will sleep a while yet. For I see that these states, notice capitalized, sleep for reasons. And think about leaves of grass. And think about the picture, that word picture we've already seen of growth. And the idea that, you know, you plant stuff, you know, what is it that Hamlet says in Hamlet, at the conclusion of Hamlet 1-2, foul deeds will rise, the wall of the earth are well known to men's eyes. This idea that you plant stuff, and there's this sense of now a growing that's about to happen. Of course, not always obviously good. He says, for I see that these states sleep for reasons, and then in parenthetics, to finish this poem, with gathering murk. You'll remember this use of the word murk. He uses it a couple of times in Leaves of Grass from Patrolling Barnegat. Murk, right? And you'll remember that we said there, it's like a symbol. Murk, you can't see. It takes us I'm finding lines from Shakespeare here regularly, aren't I? Those final lines of the witches in 1-1 of Macbeth, of fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Of course, here the word filthy gets used, and then I think murk is a lot like the fog. It's very possible that a poem like this the genesis of a poem like this will be for Whitman maybe watching a performance of Macbeth, which he had seen a number of times and loved the actors that would play that role. That is to say, the murk, the filth, the fog, it's unclear. The murk, with gathering murk, and of course the word gathering is horrific for us to read, just a few lines away from drum taps, and we know that it's coming, right? Gathering murk with muttering thunder, and we're going to hear a lot about thunder in drum taps, so obviously the cannons, and lambent shoots. Now these lambent shoots obviously will make us immediately think of Leaves of Grass. We all duly awake. Notice it's a we that takes him always back. I mean, I think in Leaves of Grass, almost every time that Whitman starts using we, he is echoing Jefferson in we hold these truths to be self-evident. We all awake. South, interesting he starts there. This is very subtle reading, but notice, he doesn't begin with the north. He doesn't say north-south, which is, interestingly, normally, I mean, when you guys say north-south, do you ever say south-north? I mean, normally it's north-south. You know what I mean? That's the way north-south, east-west, right? Well, he gets the east-west in the formulation, but notice he inverts it. South, north, east, west, and then, of course, inland and seaboard. We will surely awake. And you wonder how you read this, whether is it an affirmation, is it declarative, or is it more like questioning? Will we awake? I mean, and of course, wake to what? Like, what exactly is it we're going to wake to? I think the great poet Randall Jarrell, when he wrote Death of the Volturate Gunner, a poem I've given full lecture on it at learnstrong.net, to wake to the horrors. I think it's very possible that there's a connection that Jarrell was making in his poem. Well, what are we saying at 2A as we finish now? This poem and obviously the Roadside Collection. I think that Whitman is arguing that without great leadership, a democracy is lost, and that sooner or later, a sleeping democracy must awaken. The only question is, awaken to what, right? And it may be the horrors of conflict, and of course, in Whitman's case, it was the Great War, as we'll get to here in a moment with drum taps. I want to, at 2B, though, just talk about the poem placement here, and the way in which Whitman knows exactly what he's doing. He's made all these observations through the 29 poems of Roadside. He's talked at length in what I have called a sustained theodicy, the question of pain and evil in the world. And I think he has Milton and Paradise Lost standing behind him to justify the ways of God to men. This idea of justification of the pain and suffering in the world. And he's trying to explain it in any number of ways. O mio life has never come to thee an hour, and on it goes. But here now at the end of Roadside, right before drum taps, I think the argument that he's going to make is, if you don't have good leadership, then inevitably a democracy is going to struggle and fall asleep, right? You get drowsy. At 3A, obviously Thoreau's Walden, we've already quoted to you those lines about learning to reawaken and not by mechanical aids and all of that. I want to take us to Republic and the idea, of course, of declension of state in Republic 8. I've given full lectures on this at learnstrong.net, but that idea that once harmony, unity begins to somehow dissolve in a nation state, you are in a republic, you're inevitably going to have issues, and you know, that's obviously a challenge. Think about as well, and certainly Whitman's audience would have made this connection with drowsiness and sleeping and then waking up. They would have made the connection biblically. And of course, the most famous exemplar here is Christ's disciples in Matthew 26:40. And Christ, of course, asking, couldn't you stay awake? Like, come on, man. I mean, obviously I'm going through something here. But I think symbolically, Whitman is very much about that. You know, we've kind of fallen asleep. We have this tendency to just kind of think everything's going to continue to go along the way it always has. And Whitman says, I'm pretty sure we're going to wake up. Now, the question is, how do you read these final lines of this poem? Do you read them as hopeful? Don't worry, we're going to get through this. We're going to wake up. Or we're going to wake up to the nightmare of the war. Finally, at 3B, what are your thoughts about sleeping democracies? Do they actually reawaken? How do you read American history as it relates to this? And then finally, what are your thoughts about Roadside? Like, what's your favorite set of lines here? There's a lot of them, and as we finish these little sections, these little collections, I said that if Leaves of Grass is Whitman's attempt at the New American Bible, that what we're looking at in Roadside is kind of like maybe the Proverbs section of the Bible. Of course, without question, what we're about to enter will be the Lamentations section of the New American Bible that will culminate with, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," maybe the most famous poem Whitman ever wrote, the poem that he himself didn't like, and he didn't like to read it out loud, but it became the poem of all poems. It's interesting to think we're now 61 poems away from that poem. We're going to go through the drum tap section, and then, of course, the memories of Lincoln. Now, it is significant that I would say Lincoln, because if we're going to talk about those three presidents, then obviously we've got to talk about the great Lincoln and what it is about Lincoln that Whitman sees as so valuable. He would go to his grave believing, as of course most Americans must, that Lincoln was the savior of the republic, the savior of the democracy. Certainly the decisions that he made had a whole lot to do with the fact that you and I are here today. So we'll come back to give a set of introductory comments on drum taps, and then we'll jump right into those poems. Thank you.